This talk is about an idea of Gunnar Heinsohn's, and David was, as far as I know, not 100% convinced by Gunnar Heinsohn's ideas about chronology, but he was a man with an open mind and wide interests, and so he was particularly interested in this aspect of Gunnar Heinsohn's chronological theory, that the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia were in some way or other related to the ancient Scythians from the steppe lands of Central Asia. The idea is derived from Gunnar Heinsohn's radically shortened chronology. Gunnar holds that all of the civilizations and peoples of the 3rd millennium BC actually belong in the 1st millennium BC. He would take 2,000 years off ancient history, which is quite radical. It's far more radical even anything Velikovsky envisaged. But ultimately, of course, Velikovsky is the man who set the ball rolling with this idea that the chronology could be wrong and that it did need shortened. So I'll explain a little bit about that. Mesopotamia is not too far from the land of the Scythians because the land of the Scythians was quite big, taken in a very large area of what is now Russia, or it used to be the Soviet Union, should I say. It's now sort of a Kazakhstan and the Ukraine and basically the steppe lands, the great sort of a grassland and semi-desert region of Central Asia, was anciently known as the land of the Scythians. The Scythians were a nomadic people, generally believed to be of Indo-Iranian speech. So their language would have been related to Indo-European. That they did come into Mesopotamia is confirmed by many of the ancient authors. They're supposed to have taken part in the overthrow of the Assyrian Empire. According to Herodotus and many of the ancient writers, a large body of Scythians crossed the Caucasus Mountains and came into Mesopotamia and initially allied themselves with the Assyrians against the Medes, and were then tricked by the Medes into an ambush. I think Gunnar has, that's just some of the cities. That's the statement from Herodotus. Where he talks about these events. Now, for Gunnar Heinsohn, as I say, the peoples of the 3rd millennium are to be identified with these peoples and empires of the 1st millennium. Gunnar identified initially the Sumerians with the Chaldeans, the Akkadians with the Empire Assyrians, and the Mitannians with the Medes. How he came to these conclusions is based on the evidence of stratigraphy. He says that the material remains as found in the ground does not justify 3,000 years of history that are claimed in the modern textbooks. The Akkadians are with a great empire supposedly of the 3rd millennium, Semitic-speaking people. Their greatest kings were called Sargon and Naram-Sin. Gunnar examined the stratigraphy of northern Mesopotamia, and he found that immediately above the layers of the Akkadian Empire are found the Mitannian remains, or the Mita. Now, the Mitannians, exactly who they were is controversial. But one thing is undoubted, that their kings all had Indo-Iranian names. like Shaush Tatar and Tushratta. Indo-Iranian is basically Old Persian. And Gunnar came to the conclusion that the Mitannians must be the Medes, and the Akkadians, who seem to replace them, or who seem to have gone before them immediately, must be the Assyrians, whom they destroyed. Now, the interesting thing is that even conventional history admits that the Mitannians did in fact overthrow an Assyrian empire. They call it the Old Assyrian Empire. They don't admit that the Old Assyrian Empire was the same as the Akkadian Empire, and yet the Old Assyrians, their two most important kings were called Sargon and Naram-Sin, just like the Akkadians. So for Gunnar, the Old Assyrian Empire and the Akkadian Empire are the same. Now, this is going to be very complicated because the Old Assyrians are supposed to be in the 2nd millennium. So you've got the Akkadians in the 3rd millennium, the Old Assyrians in the 2nd millennium, and the Assyrians in the 1st millennium. So there's a triplication of history. And Gunnar believes that all this has to be brought down into the 1st millennium. History has been triplicated. Why that happened, again, is quite complicated, and I don't want to even try and explain it. But he identifies the Akkadians with the 1st millennium Assyrians of the 8th century and the Mitannians with the Medes. So he asked himself, if the Scythians, who obviously played a very important part in these events, had come into Mesopotamia at this time, they must have left some trace of their existence. And Gunnar claims that he has found this in the royal burials of Ur of the Chaldeans, the biblical Ur, which Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s. Now, these are a series of immensely rich burials. Here we have it's a kind of a tabular form, the argument for reducing the 3rd millennium events into the 1st millennium. So, Gunnar looked at the material in the royal tombs of Ur, and he came to the conclusion that the people buried in these tombs must be Scythians. Not Scythians of the 3rd millennium, but Scythians of the 1st millennium, the Scythians who took part in the Great War, which destroyed the Akkadian or the Assyrian Empire. The evidence for this is mainly to do with the artwork and the culture displayed in those tombs. Now, I have to confess that I was very skeptical about this at the start, and I thought it just couldn't be true. There is a problem of chronology. According to Leonard Woolley, the royal burials of Ur are older than the Akkadian Empire. So Leonard Woolley and conventional textbooks place these burials in the Sumerian early dynastic period, about 100 or 200 years before the rise of the Akkadian Empire. Now, even from Gunnar's point of view, the burials must come after the Akkadian Empire, because if these are Scythians who destroyed the Akkadian Empire, they can't come before the rise of the Akkadian Empire. So there seems to be, there is a problem of chronology here, and that was one of the reasons I was very skeptical about the whole thing at the start. However, when I looked at the parallels which Gunnar Heinsohn, with the help of Charles Ginenthal, I think, identified between the culture of the royal burials and the historical Scythians of Russia, then the parallels are significant, and there is obviously a case to answer here. So I'm going to look at some of these, some of the artifacts from the royal burials. He did, in fact, identify a people from the Mesopotamian documents that were unearthed. They found a people called the Gutians or the Gutians. and Gunnar identified them as the Scythians. The problem here, of course, is that the name Scythian is written in several different ways in the cuneiform writing. So they can appear as Saka or Sagaz or Gasgaz. So there are many variants of the name. And Gunnar says that Guti was one of them, or the Kuthians as they're also called, who were named as barbarians who entered Mesopotamia at the end of the Akkadian Empire. So he looks at the culture of the people that were buried in the royal tombs, and as I say, finds a lot of parallels with the Scythian people. So the people in the royal graves seem to have better teeth than your average Sumerian. I think Gunnar is basically saying that the people in the royal tombs were not Sumerians. They ruled over the Sumerians, but they were a separate race, basically, Scythians. The royal burials are characterized by human sacrifice. In fact, they're actually quite notorious for the human sacrifices. Again, it's claimed that the Sumerians didn't practice human sacrifice, and Gunnar would say that this is, in fact, one cultural characteristic of the Scythians, which is found in the royal tombs. In the royal tombs also, you have women buried with weapons, obviously female burials. Now, again, the Greek writers mentioned that some of the Scythian women were Amazons, basically. They were female warriors. The Scythians were quite known for this. And certainly in some of the Scythian tombs in Russia, women are buried with weapons. So several of the women in the royal tombs in Ur seem to have been buried with weapons, which is quite strange for Mesopotamia, but not strange for the Scythians. So here's a tomb from Russia showing human sacrifices. Again, quite typical of the Scythians, but apparently untypical of the Sumerians, according to Gunnar Heinsohn. I'm not 100% sure about that. The arch was found in some of these tombs, a corbelled arch, which is not a true arch. Basically, the walls come in until they reach each other at the top. And again, that is also found in the Scythian burials in Russia. That's some of the corbelled vaults here. So there's a Scythian tomb showing the same kind of corbelled arch. The corbelled arch, of course, is found not just in Mesopotamia and Scythia. It's found throughout the ancient world. It's found in Britain as well. So that may be evidence, but it may not be very strong evidence. So that's a Sumerian corbelled arch as well. So a sloping ramp is found again in the Sumerian and the Scythian tombs. Now there's some of the human sacrifices that were in the death pit at one of the royal tombs in Ur. There's 74 human sacrifices, apparently. Again, human sacrifice was also found in Egypt at a very early age. So again, it could be evidence of a Scythian connection, but it's not absolutely certain. If human sacrifice had only been found among the Scythians and among the Sumerians, then it would be stronger evidence. But in fact, human sacrifice was quite common almost everywhere in the ancient world, and probably everywhere. So from a Scythian tomb, sacrificed animals as well as people. And that's also found in the Sumerian tombs. Again, that's just a comment on the method of sending the sacrificial victims into the other world. Now, here's an illustration from the Royal Standard of Ur, showing a four-wheeled chariot. Now, Gunnar calls this a cart because is actually a cart. As a chariot, it wouldn't have gone very quickly. Drawn not by horses, but by asses. Now, this is conventionally believed to be the first ever chariot and the ancestor of all chariots. Later they became quicker, two-wheeled, pulled by horses. But Gunnar says that no, this is in fact a Scythian cart, not a chariot. And it's not unlike actual, so that's more, there's a Scythian ox-drawn cart. Now again, whether there's a connection between these two things, I'm not 100% sure. It does look to me as if the Sumerian chariot isn't just a cart, it's in fact a war machine. And according to the textbooks, the Akkadians, now the Akkadians, remember, come before the Sumerians in the grave pits. If Gunnar is right, the Akkadians already used the light two-wheeled chariot pulled by the horse. So I don't know how the Sumerians, if they were Scythians coming after the Akkadians, could defeat the Akkadians who are using a fast chariot if they have only these cumbersome carts to pull themselves around in. It doesn't seem likely. It does look as if the people in the grave pits are in fact older than the Akkadians, from this point of view anyway, from the point of view of chariots and carts. I'll go back there because they're not pulling bales of hay. These are pulling warriors, these chariots, Whereas the Scythian cart looks as if it's just a cart, a farmer's instrument for carrying hay or something like that, corn or whatever, provisions. So here's some Sumerian warriors, again with a chariot. And as I say, it can't be a cart. It can't be I don't think so anyway. It can't be just a agricultural instrument. This is a war machine. It's got spears in the front. But again, as I say, it's got solid wheels. It's drawn by asses. It can't have been very fast. It would have been no match for the Akkadian light two-wheeled chariot. So this is a weakness in Gunnar's argument. Now, David, as I say, remember, was not completely won over by Gunnar on this issue, and I'm sure that would have been one of the criticisms that he would have raised. However, there are, as we'll see, there's so many illustrations here. Now that is a Scythian from a Persian illustration. More Scythians, but at the bottom, a Sumerian warrior. And again, a Scythian warrior. Now, the actual culture and religion revealed in the artwork of the Sumerian burials is, I think Gunnar Heinsohn has presented a very good argument that there is some connection with ancient Scythia here. As I say, I was skeptical about this at the start, but when I looked at the actual parallels that Gunnar Heinsohn has identified, I had to rethink it. So that's one of the daggers found in the royal burials, and that's a Scythian dagger. Vague similarity. I mean, it might mean something, it might mean nothing. A picture of a lion or a panther from the royal graves, a Scythian lion or a panther. It could be significant, it might not be. Sumerian jewelry. Now, the headdresses of these queens or royal women in the Sumerian graves does display very sophisticated mastery of the goldsmith's art, and they seem to be too big for the head, outsized. And this was a significant fact that Gunnar Heinsohn mentioned. because the same type of headdresses were attested among the Scythians. So it says here, wealthy Scythian women, it seems, were literally covered in gold from head to toe. The headdress covered in gold plaques, etc. So these headdresses of Scythian women were too big for their heads. They were outsized, a bit like the headdresses of the women in the royal tombs of Ur. And they had to have some kind of a padding so that the crown would actually fit on their heads in both cases. That's another Scythian headdress. Sumerian jewelry. Scythian jewelry. Again, certain similarity. It may be significant, it might not. And Sumerian jewelry. The use of the rosette as a decorative motif, again, found among the Scythians and found among the Sumerians, but not unique to either country either. It's also found among the Greeks and various others. So it could be significant and it might not be. There's the rosette in Scythian jewelry. Now this is really significant. This is a famous sculpture of a goat caught in a thicket from one of the royal burials in Ur. Now, as an artistic motif, I don't know if it's unique, it's very unusual. And I don't think it occurs in Egyptian art or Greek art for that matter. But it does also occur in Scythian art. Now, this is, I believe, quite significant. Now, you can't see it here because the actual axe would need to be turned up that way. But these are two goats standing up on their hind legs eating some kind of a plant, you know. And that's from a Scythian axe, I believe. Well, that's Sumerian again. And Scythian beneath it. Two goats again, antithetic, opposite each other. Right, there's the two Scythian goats nibbling leaves, just like the Sumerian goat and its hind legs. A fairly precise cultural parallel, maybe referring to some myth. So some Scythian gold work. Now here again, from the royal standard of Ur, there's a winged panther, a lion or a lioness with eagle's wings. And again, there is a similar motif found in Scythian art. A winged lion, again, not unique. I mean, it's also found in Greek myth as the Sphinx and Egyptian myth. So winged panthers around a central figure, or this here, of course, is the ultimately derived from the tree of life, or the world axis, the coiled serpents. Not unique either to Mesopotamia and Scythia. In fact, occurring almost throughout the world. But to have the two winged panthers on either side is fairly significant. So again, the Sumerian and Scythian winged panthers, stags in both cultures. Sumerian helmet made in the form of a human hairdo, and Scythian helmets apparently were quite similar in some ways. Scythian helmet and another Scythian helmet. Now, some of this art looked fantastic. You could just spend the whole day just looking at it. The question then is, was Gunnar Is Gunnar Heinsohn right? Are the people in the royal tombs of our Scythian invaders of Mesopotamia after the fall of the Akkadian Empire? The evidence, I mean, I would have to say probably not. It looks like, to me, that the Leonard Woolley was correct in placing these burials before the Akkadian Empire. As far as I know, there's very little iron has been found. There's no iron tools or weapons have been found in the royal tombs. Maybe small artifacts of iron. I'm not too sure about that. But certainly the material culture displayed in the tombs looks archaic. It looks very, very old. However, that does not rule out any connection with Scythia, because I think Gunnar Heinsohn has in fact hit on something of great importance here. I worked in Hungary a few years back, and I was astonished when I was there to learn that the Hungarian language, now Hungarian is not related to any of the Indo-European based languages of Europe. It's virtually unique. There's supposed to be some connection with Finnish, although Hungarians say that they can't understand a word the Finnish people say. And there's supposed to be, again, some connection with Estonian. But the astonishing thing is that Hungarian seems to be very closely related to ancient Sumerian. Now, when I heard that first, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was just a crackpot theory, a fringe theory. In fact, it's been known now for several decades, and the similarity is not just confined to vocabulary, but also involves grammar and syntax. And some people say that, in fact, Hungarian is more closely related to Scythian than to any, or to Sumerian than to any other language. Now, that brings to mind some of the comments. Now, the Hungarians undoubtedly came from Scythia. They came from the steppe lands of Central Asia. The ancient writers described all of the peoples who came from that region as Scythians. The Roman writers called the Huns and the Avars and the Magyars Scythians. They used that term for all of them. Now, to this day, there are the Hungarian-speaking people of eastern Transylvania, who claim to be direct descendants of the Huns, incidentally, still call themselves Székelyes. And the name apparently has got some connection with the word Saka, or Scythian. And again, that brings to mind several comments of the ancient authors. Herodotus mentions a dispute between the Scythians and the Egyptians as to who was the most ancient nation. And a Roman writer called, I think his name, now I've lost my notes. I had all this written out, and I left it at home along with my boarding card, and I wouldn't have got on the plane at all, but for the kindly lady at the bus station printed me out another boarding card. But it was Trogus Pompeius, I think, was the name of the Roman writer, who said that the Scythians were the most ancient nation in the world, and that they had inhabited Mesopotamia for 1,500 years before any of the other peoples arrived in Mesopotamia, which is astonishing. If that is correct, then it is clear that the ancient Sumerians did indeed have some link with Scythia, with the steppe lands of Central Asia. And it would be a kind of a missing link between that and the connection between Hungarian and Sumerian. It's a fascinating area of study, and I think it requires a lot more investigation. So the conclusion I would come to is that Gunnar has not been 100% right in identifying the Sumerians with the Indo-Iranian Scythians of later times who came and destroyed the Akkadian Empire. But I think that the Sumerians did indeed have some connection or were directly descended from an ancient people of the steppes, the Scythians. As I say, this idea of Scythian as meaning the ethno-linguistic connection with the Indo-Iranian languages is only a modern idea. The ancient writers called all of the peoples of the steppes Scythians. That was the term they used. So, and of course, all the peoples of the steppes would have influenced each other culturally anyway. So we shouldn't be surprised with apparent artistic and cultural similarities between the Sumerians and the later Scythians of the steppes. Personally think it's a fascinating idea, and it requires a lot more study. The connection between Sumerian and Hungarian is still controversial. I think the academic establishment takes a long, long time to get their heads around any new idea at all. They tend to be petrified like some of the dinosaurs that they dig up now and again. Their brains seem to be fossilized like a lot of them. But there seems to be some connection anyway, some very, very clear connection between Hungarian and Sumerian. And I think that's about it. Any questions on that? Yeah?
Sorry to start off again. But is there any possibility as a diagnostic tool that female mitochondrial DNA could settle some of these questions?
I'm sure it could, yeah.
But has it been tried?
I don't know if it has been. I haven't been able to find any information on that. Most of the information I've got about, for example, the connection between Hungarian and Sumerian has come from the internet. It was Hungarian people told me about it first, but then I couldn't find much in textbooks about it. So I don't know if it has been tried. It probably hasn't. And yet there has been a lot of studies about the origins of European populations and how they did tend to come from either the Middle East or Central Asia. So I don't really know. It's a question I would need to examine in more detail myself, you know. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah?
That's something you probably haven't looked at. It only just occurred to me, are there any other graves in Sumeria that one could compare with these, which show different features? I mean, I don't know.
Again, I assumed that, the things that Gunnar's...
These are not the only ones.
Yeah. I assumed that the things that Gunnar were saying were unique to the royal burials that were in fact common, like human sacrifice, etc., in ancient Sumeria. Because I know human sacrifice was common in early dynastic Egypt. There were a number of tombs which mastaba burials where human sacrifice was quite widely practiced. So I don't know. The royal burials tend to be the most talked about, and so Gunnar seems to say here that in fact other Sumerian burials have been found which don't show human sacrifice and don't show these parallels with Scythian customs, but I can't really say for sure about that.
Has any of these burials and sacrificed people had their genetics checked by geneticists to see if there is a link?
Again,
because
I'm
you
not
can still get genetic material from buried people, can't you?
Without question, yeah. I mean, that would be something that would be quite important to do, I don't know if it has been done yet. I know that this genome project has already thrown up some astonishing facts. Like, for example, some of the inhabitants of the New World have Old World DNA in them,
Yes.
specifically from Spain and Northwest Africa, the land of the Atlantes. So, I mean, it's fairly
That's why
fairly dramatic things have already been produced by this. So I'm sure even more dramatic revelations will come forward. But at the moment, I
no sharing.
can't be sure at the moment.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Are there any other countries that have 2,000 or 3,000 years missing from their chronology?
According to Gunnar, yes, all civilizations rose simultaneously in the aftermath of a great cosmic catastrophe around 1,300, 1,400 BC. That would be Velikovsky's Venus catastrophe, which left the great layer of debris at Ur, 8 to 10 foot layer of silt. And with the goings on in the cosmos, people were inspired to build pyramids and offer sacrifice to the gods to keep away further destruction. And the word altar, of course, just means a high place where you offered these blood sacrifices. So human sacrifice was practiced all over the world at one time. So Gunnar would say that the civilizations of the New World rose simultaneously with the civilizations of the Old World. Then again, that wouldn't explain all of the precise parallels between the civilizations of the Old World and the New World, because some of them are so precise that they can't be put down just to that. In fact, there is evidence of ancient transatlantic contact. But yeah, Gunnar Heinsohn would say the Chinese civilization, the Middle Eastern civilizations, and the American civilizations all arose about 1,100 BC. And all this idea of third millennium civilizations is they're all duplicates and triplicates. The second millennium civilizations are duplicates, and the third millennium civilizations are triplicates of the first millennium civilizations. It's quite a radical idea, but there is a lot of evidence to support it, as far as I can see. Anything else? Any questions I can answer? Only ask me questions I can answer. Yes.
It seems to me that possibly one of the weaknesses of Gunnar's theory is the fact that scholarship seems to accept the Scythians as being associated with a particular fairly late date in antiquity.
Yes.
If there were proof to show that those Scythian peoples existed many millennia earlier, it would actually make his theory very plausible. And that evidence does exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It actually does exist that the Scythians, on their home territory, were there for many millennia before. And the antiquities in Ukraine, particularly at their own sacred site, Karyana Mahila, show that in the grottos there was Proto-Sumerian writing there from at least 12,000 BC. Going through their history to that point, and then added to over the years, and actually describing the flood, where when the people from ancient Ukraine had travelled to Sumer, Mesopotamia, they were cut off by the flood.
Yeah,
and it actually talks about this.
Yeah, I mean,
it seems astonishing, doesn't it?
Yes.
It has to come to wider notice.
I mean, personally, I would go with Gunnar for the shorter chronology, but it doesn't rule out that other areas of the world did have very early literate civilizations. I know that in the Balkans region, Southeast Europe, there was a culture there, at least as old as Sumeria, with writing, with written script, the Vincha culture. And there's evidence that the megalithic peoples had some, in the Western Europe, had some form of writing as well, some way of record keeping anyway. But that needn't completely overrule Gunnar's chronological conclusions either, So I think you have to remember that the idea that civilizations are many, many millenniums older, or they go into, 3rd or 4th or 5th millennia in the past, BC, is largely based on, if you go back to it, it was based ultimately on a kind of a fundamentalist interpretation of the Old Testament. Even, Napoleon went to Egypt 20 years before the first hieroglyphs were read, and he looked at the Great Pyramid, and he said to his men, just before the Battle of the Pyramids, he says, 40 centuries look down on you. So he was placing the pyramids 2,200 BC. That was 20 years before the science of Egyptology was even invented. Now that is actually a date still very close to the date still found in the textbooks. Where did Napoleon get this idea? Because he got the idea from the already existing Egyptian chronologies, which were based in the Bible, which were appearing in European textbooks at that time. The force of habit of the academic community is so. Their brains are fossilized mostly. They can't think out of the box. They think, it says in the textbook that the pyramids were built 2,200 BC. We maybe take that back a century or two, but we can't just, rule it out completely. It must be true. It's in books, But it was actually based on the Old Testament. It was based on the idea that Adam and Menes, the first pharaoh, were the same person. And everybody knows Adam lived in 4,000 BC. And so Menes lived in 4,000 BC, and you could fill in the whole of Egyptian chronology as outlined by Manetho after that. And you had certain points, reference points, like Ramesses, the great Ramesses. He must have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, because it says in the book of Exodus that the Israelites built a city called Ramesses. So it must have been him. So you place Ramesses II where the Bible says the Exodus is about 1,400 BC. And he's still there. Oh, they've moved him down a century or two into 1,300 BC. But he's still there where he was placed in Napoleon's time and 100 years and 200 years before that. So we have to be careful about all these thousands and thousands of years BCE. They don't really have any scientific justification. And they're there because, as I say, academics haven't been able to get out of their head that the whole thing just needs to be swept aside, and we need to begin from the beginning, looking at what we can actually find in the ground. A principle that Gunnar set out, which is a very good principle, is if we can't find any evidence of it in the ground, it probably didn't exist. It's quite a good principle.